we have the open fill panel. So earlier in one of my knowledge nugget snippets, we spoke about how you can change the color of an object up here in a quick fashion. If you want more detailed options, then you would go over here to the paint palette and use your fill panel. Notice that you actually have those same color options, and you can also change the transparency of that object, so you can give it different hues. You can also type in advanced options. So the Carolina Gamecock Garnet is 73000A. If I was to type that in, notice that it turns Gamecock Garnet. I just had to throw that in there. Over here we have a gradient fill. The gradient fill and your patterns are really only effective to either demonstrate for a client what it could look like, or when you're using a print feature. It will not matter because Silhouette and Cricut are colorblind, which means that it only knows to cut the image that you're telling it to cut, not the color that it is on your screen. So don't get bent around the axle. If you don't know 73000A is Gamecock Garnet, it's not going to matter as long as your vinyl is that color. But in order to demonstrate what that would look like, notice how you can see a gradient change by changing the different gradients. Same thing with you coming over here to the fill panel. If you come to the fill, if you have a vinyl that looks like this, as we do in Splurge, you can get an idea of what that's actually going to look like. Same with this particular pattern. We have this pattern at Splurge as well. If you want to go back to your original color, you would just go back here, and the last couple colors that you use should populate in your panel up here. Mine didn't, so we're going to go back to my advanced options. And we're going to change the Cricut back to Gamecock Garnet. The next option that you have is the line panel. If you look, you will notice that on this image, you can see, for this image, you can see that the line is red. If you would like the line to be another color, you can just go in here and select another color, and notice how the line changes, but the inside is still hollow because you have not chosen a fill color. So remember, the fill color is down here on the top left. Then next to it is the line color. That's the difference between those two. You also can change it over here. If you hit this right here, that's where you can also change it. And once again, you have the transparency option, and you have the option to give it the exact color code that it needs for the color that you want. Another thing to note up here is that you have line styles. So if you're trying to do a score line or a dotted line or anything of that nature, you would go up here to change your line style. So if we draw a line using our line tool, and we wanted that line to be a score line, we could select this, and if you zoom in, you will see that it has changed from a straight line to a score line. You can also change your line thickness by increasing or decreasing the thickness right here. This will not actually change when you cut it. This is more for a visual than anything else. We are now going to go back to what I refer to as homeostasis, which is where we fit back to the window. Another neat feature of the trace is that you can trace by color when you have the Design Plus. By doing this, you can select only those items that are in your image that are of one particular color. You would select the eyedropper and tell it to trace by color. You would then take the eyedropper to the color that you're trying to trace, and once again notice that it only sees some of our image. In order for it to see all of the image, first of all, we wanted to tell it to select the fill, and not the single area, but all areas of our image. We would then, unlike in the original trace, you use threshold. In this case, we are using tolerance, which essentially accomplishes the exact same thing. We already traced, and we saw that that left us a silhouette. When we use trace and detach, it's like using a pair of scissors and cutting that image out of the background that it's in. It will take a couple of seconds for it to do that, but once it does, you'll notice that if I move the background away, I actually traced and detached that image from the original image. This is quite useful if you need it to be this exact same color because you're doing a print option. Image effects works on different images differently. If you want to change image effects around your image, then you would change, for example, the amount of gray shade that you want in the image. You can go over here and change the hue of your image. You can change the brightness of your image. These are all if you're going to be doing some kind of print and cut. Once again, Silhouette and Cricut are colorblind. They do not know the color, they know the vinyl that's on there, and they know the image to cut into that vinyl. So it's great for print and cut, or if you're going to be doing invitations or something of that nature, but by and large, when working with vinyl, this is not a tool you're going to use very frequently. We're now going to talk about your text style, which is also known as your font. If you notice, I particularly chose a script font in order to demonstrate the importance of the weld and the group and or make compound path feature. As you can see, when I zoom into this image, it sees my name as 6 separate letters. In order for it to see my name as an entire image, we have to go through 2 steps. The first step is you right click and you tell it to weld. Weld will tape together, if you will, all the objects that are actually touching. Notice I now have 2 separate boxes inside of my main sized box. This is because Silhouette now sees my name as 2 separate images. So Weld only works on those items that are actually touching. In order to get Silhouette to see this as one solid item after we weld, we need to either group or make the compound path. Notice when I tell it to group, it is now one box. It now sees my name as one solid image. When I click on my name, however, you notice that you lost the opportunity to change the font. If you are dissatisfied with this font, you can either hit undo a few times to go back to your original, or you can delete it and type it out again. You are not limited but to your own imagination. So, you also have a bold option. If your particular font has a bold option, you can italicize. If your font has that option, you can underline. You can either align to the left, center, right, or just use this feature right here. Very, very similar to using any other Microsoft product or anything of that nature where you're typing with words. You can also increase your line spacing and your character spacing. Kerning chooses whether or not it's going to choose its own spacing or whether or not it chooses a more natural spacing. I tend to leave kerning on because if you notice, it brings it together more naturally. If you have the upgrade to Design Plus, you'll also notice that you have glyphs. Those glyphs are those little features or whatever that don't naturally show up when you type certain letters. Frequently, as you can see, you have different language options or whatever. So if you needed to change out an item for a different letter or something of that nature, you can actually double click on it. And if we go to homeostasis, you will notice that it appears up here on the top left. You would then bring it to your image where you wanted to insert it with your image. And then we would have to once again go through a weld. And then we would have to go through, because it sees it as 3 objects, we would have to then go again to group in order to make it one solid object. The same thing is true when we had our name wrapped around that ellipse. Remember I told you that there is a way to keep your image curved, but that you would need to do that after you chose your particular font. We again would use our weld feature. And now it sees, because none of my letters were touching, it sees it as 6 separate items. And then we would make a group. Once we've welded it and made the group, if we get rid of that ellipse, it will then stay in that original configuration. Next, we move on to our transform box. This is where you're going to be doing most of your designing, between your transform all the way down to your offset feature. The transform box allows you to center items and align items. So it's important to understand that if you want to choose more than one item, you have 2 options to do that. You can either left click and hold and drag a box around those images until you've selected everything and it's all in the original box. If you have different items scattered around the page, you can also left click on one item, Hold your Shift key down without releasing it and click on the other item. Notice that there is a box around this Cricut and there's a box around my name, but there is no box around this one. This means that I have eliminated this as an option for it to be manipulating it, and it's going to ignore the fact that it's there. So now that we have selected two items, let's say that we want to center it on the actual canvas itself. Then you would use center to the page. If you are trying to center one object on top of the other, you would use the center tool. Notice how it put my name on top of the Cricut. Is it always precise? No. You can always remanipulate it if you're not satisfied with how it puts one image on top of the other. This is entirely your creation. You are not limited but by your own imagination. You can also select items and align them to the left, center, right, top, bottom, as you can see these options. Moving on to your scale, you have two options. You can either scale by percentage, which has presets, or you can actually give it a number and it'll scale to that particular number that you give it. You can do the same thing over here with specifying your dimensions. This is where I told you that you can actually give it the exact size that you want it. In this case, notice how when I click on my image, it sees it as 2.502 by 0.682. If I want to size this image symmetrically, which means that I'm sizing the height and the width at the same time, I must lock it first. Then if I give it a dimension, whether it's the height or the width, it is going to scale the height and the width together. If I was to leave it unlocked and I gave it a particular dimension and I did not lock it, it's going to change the width, but it is not going to change, or it is going to leave the height the same. So if you want it to size symmetrically, you absolutely must lock it first, and then it will do it the way that you need it to do it. Another way to size symmetrically and asymmetrically is by using these points right here. If you left click and hold on northeast, southeast, northwest, or southwest, it'll size your image symmetrically. If you want to manipulate the height without the width, or vice versa, you are going to use north, east, south, or west. By pulling on those, notice how you're going to scale it either by height or by width, but not both at the same time. If you're dissatisfied with how it looks, don't forget you can always use your undo button. The next option we have is a rotate feature. As with everything else in Silhouette, you have presets, or you can actually tell it the exact way you want it to rotate. So if we want it rotated 33%, we would input that data and it now rotated at 33%. Or we can choose a standard rotation that they have as a preset. Again, you can also rotate by using the slide bar, and it's going to rotate that image. This is for designing on the XY axis. If you're an engineer or you're really working on true graphic design, this might be purposeful for you. I do not design that way, so I just pointed out that that is a feature. This feature comes with the Design Plus. It's a horizontal and vertical shear. This is a neat feature because it'll just shear your image, whether you would like to shear it a little, a lot, or whether or not you want to use a custom shear. You can do that as well. Same thing with the vertical shear. You can shear custom or you can shear however you want. Again, this only comes with the Design Plus. This does not come with the basic, so if you're looking for that feature and you have the basic, you're not going to see it. Moving on to the next tool. The next tool we have is a replicate tool. The replicate tool will either replicate it by a set number of items, or it's going to replicate it by any number you choose. So you can duplicate once to the left, once to the right, one down, one up, two to the right, three to the right, two down, three down, or you can fill the page. Be mindful that if you fill the page, it is going to fill the page as many times as it believes that it can fit that image in a rational fashion. Could you actually add more to this? Yes. If I go like this and then I tell it to duplicate, yes, I could probably add another one. So you are not limited once again to what Silhouette believes to be rational, but just know that it is going to fill it the way that it believes that it rationally would work. So we're going to get rid of most of these. And now we're going to show the mirror. When you hear mirror, typically you're talking about heat transfer vinyl, and you're flipping it over so that it will cut it opposite direction of what you're actually going to put it on the shirt, so that when you weed it away and you put it on the shirt, it's actually considered right reading. In this case, on the silhouette, mirror does not mean that. Mirror literally is going to take that image and it's going to mirror that image in the exact direction that you tell it to. So be mindful, this is not the mirror that you need when you're going to be cutting HTV. This is a rotate feature. So let's just say I want to make a kaleidoscope out of my name. If I clicked on my name and I clicked on this feature, it's going to rotate my name upon itself multiple times. If you come over here, you can tell it the exact number that you need it to replicate. So let's just say that I need to replicate the item that I have 7 times. So we're going to delete that and we're going to come here and we're going to tell it we want it to replicate 7 times. Now you can have it replicate on top of itself. You can have it do it 7 times to the left, right, up, down, or if you tell it that you're going to customize it, which I just did, and told it to replicate, it's going to create 7 of the original image where I can choose and specifically place those wherever I need to on my mat. So that's just a custom number. I now usually go to the offset panel and I skip over the modify panel for a reason. Most people want to know how to do knockouts and offsets. In order to do a knockout and an offset, we're going to manipulate my little Cricut right here. Notice how I'll make my name yellow so we can see it really well. Notice how if I want to place one item on top of the other item, I can click on one, hold the shift key down, and click on another item. Don't forget, we also have the centering tool, so I can go back here and ask it to center on my Cricut. I'm not satisfied with how that looks, so I'm going to move it manually. And I'm going to make it a little bit bigger so that we can see my name over the Cricut symbol. In order to do a knockout, you would select your image and you can create what we refer to as the offset. When I hit offset, if you notice, it creates what seems to be like a shadow behind my name. If I click on it and make it another color, I think it would be easier for you to be able to actually see that. Then I'm going to move my name by going back to the centering option, selected them both, and I move my name back on top of that other piece of the image. Now I'm going to move it to where I want to on my Cricut. Now that we've created the offset, we can go back here to your modify panel. With your modified panel, I call the subtract all the cookie cutter. It's just like cutting through dough. Whatever is on top is going to slice into what's behind it. That's going to slice into what's behind that, so you can do multiple layers. So in this case, I'm going to select all of these and I'm going to tell it to subtract all. Once I've done that, I can now move the Amanda away and I can move the other Amanda away where I created that offset. Notice now it's hollow on the inside of this image. If we change it to blue, you'd be able to see that a little bit better. So now you notice that we can either leave this in place and leave the inside hollow. We have the option to move Amanda back into the original place because we sliced it out, or we could have left it with our original image. Why is this helpful? It's helpful because you're not supposed to layer vinyl on vinyl because you have a higher risk of lifting or early lifting. By using your offsets, you're slicing one layer into the next, and then you can cut each independent vinyl and press them as though they look like they are layered, but in actuality, it is each different piece of vinyl that is actually adhered to the shirt itself or the garment. So, for example, if this was glitter, which you cannot layer on, and the yellow was glitter, which you cannot layer on top of, then you can actually cut this in the glitter, you can cut your yellow in yellow glitter, you can cut your blue in whatever kind of vinyl you want to, and then you would press in layers. You would first press your Cricut, you would then press your inside color, and then you would press your outside color, giving you a layered look without having the risk of early lifting. Other options that we have in here are your make compound path, subtract all, divide. When using divide, I typically go and find fire pattern. I'll find some pattern that I actually like, and let's just say we're going to go with this one. So I'm going to copy that image, right click copy. I'm going to come back to the silhouette. I'm going to right click and paste. We now need to trace our fire image. So we're going to go back to our trace. We're going to tell it to select the trace area. And we're going to trace the fire. We're going to increase our threshold to 100% to make sure that it sees the entire image. And then we're going to tell it to trace and detach. We have now left ourselves a sample of the fire. Now, if we want to take the fire over, sorry, I'm trying to increase the size. There we go. And we're going to put the Amanda behind that. We are then going to select both of those images, just the fire and the Amanda behind it, and you're going to tell it to divide. Again, this is very useful for print and cut, not if you're just cutting vinyl. But it's important to notice, now you see that I have now created what appears to be a fire background or color versus actually being that blue color that we had before. So that's why we use the divide feature. Now we're going to talk about compound path, both making and releasing your compound path. If you click on your image and you right click and tell it to release the compound path, you'll notice that we have multiple different squares. That's because we have told Silhouette to break this into each of its individual components. We are now able to manipulate this image the way that we want to. We can take the eyeball out and delete it. And we can remove this eyeball and delete it. We can come over here and create a small circle. Then we can right click and duplicate another small circle. We can now move these circles into the eyes where we had the other shape of the eyes. We could also, for example, get rid of the cheekbones. So if you remember our original image that looked like the Grinch, we have now created our own version of the Grinch. Now you have the option that you can group or you can make the compound path. When you group, it's telling the Silhouette that you want this image to be grouped together and you want everything that you apply to it to apply to everything. Notice how the eyes are still green because you just grouped it. If you were to make the compound path, you would notice that then it sees it as one solid image and it sees it in the original state that you had it. If you don't want that, you can always hit the undo and you can go back to the group. Usually choosing group or make compound path is a personal preference, but often if you make a compound path, you cannot always undo it to the original state. You may have to recreate it. So if you can use group, I recommend group over the compound path. But notice how your tools are under the modify panel, make and release compound path. You also have those as presets in your right click for quick, easy use. Notice that a lot of your features here are the features that you see up here. So the system is quite duplicative in that way that you can find these same tools to use in different locations. It's all about personal preference. But for me, I tend to use the right click most frequently. We've already spoken about the offset, but I'd just like to show that when you do an offset of an image, if you click on that image and you do an offset, you are not limited to the size of the offset that they give you. You can actually increase or decrease the size of the offset. You can also make it squared off versus rounded. It is all, once again, personal preference. You can also do an internal offset, which sometimes it shows up well and sometimes it doesn't. But when you do the internal offset, it basically does an offset inside of your image versus on the outside of your image. So it just gives you more layered effects. This tool right here is converting a shape to a pop-up. So if we were going to take our Grinch and we wanted to make a pop-up image of our Grinch, we would click on this image. Sorry, it's trying to get rid of this and this. Okay. You would click on your image, and in this particular situation, It is trying to decide where it would put the score lines and the cut lines in order for you to be able to use this on cardstock or something of that nature. Just understand that this is a very complex project, and the more complex your image is, the longer it potentially is going to take for it to complete this particular task. Be patient, it's not frozen, it's just processing. The next tool that we're going to talk about is the Rhinestone Feature. The Rhinestone Feature is super popular because you can actually create a rhinestone image or a rhinestone looking image without actually using rhinestones. First thing you're going to do is you're going to create whatever it is that you're trying to make look like rhinestones. You typically want to use a chunkier font in order for it to be effective and for you to actually be able to create an image that you can tell looks like rhinestones. We'll go back to the Rhinestone panel. Let me remind you that this comes with Design Plus. This is an upgrade. You will not find this on your basic. But you're going to tell it your standard rhinestone size typically is 10 SS, and you're going to tell it whether you want it to do the outline, whether you want it to do a linear fill, or whether you want it to do a radial fill. In our case, we're going to choose the linear fill. And if you look closely, I will make it a new color for you so you can see it a little bit better. You see it now looks like multiple different rhinestones. It's all each separate dots. Now, you can also freehand and move and take away. You can change the spacing so that they're a little bit closer together or a little bit further apart. This is up to you and your own personal design preferences. In my case, I would like to see it a little bit closer together. There we go. Oops, went a little bit too much. Okay. It's fickle. Now, if you were to cut this, you would want to first reverse it. Mirror it is what it's referred to when using heat transfer vinyl. So in order to reverse an image, you're going to right click and you're going to tell it to flip horizontally. Now it's ready to cut on heat transfer vinyl. If you were cutting this on regular 651 indoor outdoor or 631 grade indoor vinyl, then you would not mirror the image. But in this case, we were going to be cutting it on HTV, so we mirrored our image. You would then send it, and you would have to tell it what material you're cutting it on. In my case, I would be cutting it on heat transfer smooth. And then you can also tell it what tool you're using. I am not currently connected to one of the silhouettes, so it's not going to give me the same options that you may see. See how it says no tool detected? That's because I'm not connected. But if I was going to be using the auto blade, I would tell it that I was using the auto blade, which is typically the default. Now, if you have two images on your screen, and you want to cut the 2021, but you do not want to cut the Grinch. If you were to click on the Grinch, you can tell it no cut. This way, it can stay on the proverbial mat, but the silhouette knows not to cut that particular image. That's why it seems a little bit dulled out, because it's not supposed to cut it. This image, on the other hand, you can see is very vivid because it knows that it's cutting this particular image. We can then go down here to tell it what cut settings we want it to use. Each silhouette is different and each person has their own personal preference. Despite the fact that Silhouette has their default presets, if you're not using the vinyl that it was default preset for, then it's not going to cut your vinyl the right way. The way I mitigate that is I always come down here and tell it to do a test cut. It's going to cut a small triangle inside of a small square, and it's going to be in the upper left corner of your vinyl. If you are able to weed away that square, leaving the triangle without having to fight with it, then you know that it should cut through your vinyl well. Once again, I know my Silhouette. When I get a good test cut, I always increase the blade coming out of the housing by at least 1, and I usually increase my force by about 5, 6, somewhere around there. When cutting with heat transfer glitter, I will show you that. When you're cutting heat transfer glitter, you'll see that the force is at the highest point that it can get to. So what I typically do, if I get a good test cut, is I will increase the blade coming out of the housing, not by 1, but by 2. This way, I feel confident that it's going to cut through my glitter without having any issue. Then you're going to tell it to send. It's going to ask you whether or not you want to mirror the image. If you mirrored the image on your design page, you do not have to tell it to mirror. If you did not mirror it on the design page, what I usually do is I close it out, I go back to my design page, and I mirror it on the design page because I've already got the vinyl on the mat exactly where I want it to cut it. If you allow Silhouette to mirror this image here on the computer itself or on the cut screen itself, it's actually literally going to flip it over and mirror it to a different side. So it's only going to see maybe this portion of the two because it will have flipped the whole thing over. And it's only going to cut that little piece of the two, and it's not going to cut the rest of your image. So I always tell it to close out. I go back to my design screen and I hit right click and tell it to flip horizontally. And then I go back to my send screen. That is how you do faux rhinestones. A final fun feature of the Silhouette is the warp feature. This is what most people get the Design Plus option for because it allows you to warp your image in order to fit on conical or bulbous objects like ornaments or vases or cups. If you hit the warp, you see that you have the option of a free warp. So you would hit the warp selected shapes and notice that it gives you multiple points. You can grab and hold any one of those points and pull your image in whatever direction you want to pull it. Oops. If you are dissatisfied with what it looked like, you can tell it to restore to the original shape. The next option you have is the presets. I call this one Return of the Jedi. Notice how it has that going into the background kind of look. We are not limited to this, however, we can still continue to warp this object in whatever direction we want to warp it. So the preset is not limited, you can still manipulate what it looks like. The final one, Restore the Original Shapes, is to warp around a conical shape. If you know your actual shape and you want to use these nodes, you can use these nodes to create the shape. You can also say conical warp shape, and notice you have this little conical looking shape that shows up around your image. It now allows you to put in the data that you need in order for it to know what warp size and spacing and direction to go. So if our top of our cup was 4 inches, the bottom of our cup is 3 inches. Notice how this image is starting to change as we tell it what the dimensions of the cup is. And you'll notice that it's changing in here as well. Despite the fact that it doesn't look as though it's made considerable changes, I assure you it has. And just as with any other image, when you are done manipulating it, if you want to stay in that exact configuration, you must weld it to make sure that anything that it is touching is going to stay in that configuration, and then you're going to either group or make the compound path. It will now stay in this configuration for when you send it to cut. When it cuts, it may look a little bit off, and that's understandable because it has been warped, but when you put it on that conical shape that you're putting it on, it will look straight. You'll have less chances of it buckling and less chances of it looking as though it's crooked. One final thing that I want to talk about is mirroring. I did mention it in one segment, but I would like to mention it here as well. We spoke about when using most heat transfer vinyls, they are on a heat transfer tape. For that reason, you have to mirror your image, which means that it's going to cut it backwards. And then you're going to weed away everything that you don't want on the shirt, kind of like weeding a garden, you're taking the weeds out. When you flip that heat transfer vinyl over, it will then be what's referred to as right reading, or it'll look the way that you need it to look to go on that shirt. In order to flip that item or mirror it, you're going to click on it so that it's selected. We know it's selected because it has a box around it. You're going to right click and tell it to flip horizontally. It is now prepared to be cut on heat transfer vinyl.